All right, we're going to go back into the past, into yesteryear, and talk about things that happened in the early 19th century. As I think I made it clear, I have great interest in the question of the difference between the old world and the new world, and whether we are warranted in writing modern history as if the old world, the new world, or Europe and the Americas were on a similar trajectory, even if at different rates, or whether there are fundamental differences. But that being, that's sort of the broad perspective that I'm interested in. I'm going to talk about three specific topics that come out of the French Revolution, and particularly out of the Napoleonic period following the French Revolution. The first of these is law, the second one is military, the third one is religion. With respect to law, it is pretty straightforward. You had four legal scholars were employed by Napoleon to write up a law code, which was a code of civil law. It later became known as the Code Napoleon, but that was not its original name. And it was an effort to put down in comprehensive and logical form a code of laws for the state. The Code Napoleon remains the basic shape of French law down to the present day, and it becomes a pattern for the legal systems of most of the rest of Europe. So this is a type of codification that really has only two parallels that I can think of. One of them is the Justinian Code that goes back to the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century, and the other one is the Great Tang Law Code in China, going back to the 10th century, where you had efforts to simply think of the legal system in its totality. This is not a product of the Revolution. This is a product of the Napoleonic period, but it becomes possible because of the disappearance of the monarchy, and therefore the disappearance of the idea that you had a monarch, a sovereign who had essentially sovereign capacity to create law or to change law. Britain does not become subject to this, and so the law that you have in the United States is descended from the common law of Britain, which is dramatically different from the Code Napoleon. It's not a straightforward civil code, but rather a ongoing cumulative tradition in which citing decisions in earlier cases is the common way of proceeding to a decision and to deciding how to rule on a new case, as opposed to simply going back to the text of the law code. Common law is the best parallel for common law is the Islamic Sharia, because there what a jurist would do or a judge would do would be to look at the case at hand and then go back and review all of the texts that would be pertinent to that case from authoritative sources like the Quran and the Hadith, but also look at how earlier jurists had ruled in these cases, so that you would have decisions that were based on a very lengthy and scholarly survey of all of the previous decisions by important people on a given case, and then the jurisprudent would come up with his own conclusion as to what should be the case here. So then the collected opinions of important jurists would be published and would become the references that would be used. So the common law and the Sharia are in one category, where you're dealing with precedent and you're dealing with an exploration of how similar cases were decided in earlier times, as opposed to the codified law of the Code Napoleon, where you have simply the text of the law. The Islamic law, as it came to be applied in in North Africa, is closer to the codified law of the Code Napoleon. That is to say, there's one school of Islamic law that is specific to North Africa, the Maliki school, that produced handbooks like law codes and seemed to give them more importance than the survey of earlier opinions that you had in the other Muslim law schools. I'm kind of making these comparisons because we often think that legal traditions really don't bear comparison across cultural boundaries, but in fact, it's very useful, I think, to realize that the way jurists think is very much that falls into certain types of thinking. Jewish law, for example, would fall more into the case of Sharia and common law than in the case of codified law. There's no Jewish law code, but there are several thousand years of opinions that prominent people have taken, and when you have an issue, you go back and you survey the Talmud and the response of the collections of opinions of medieval and early modern rabbis in order to find out what the text of the law, how it should be applied in the current, in the case at hand. So this was a major consequence or major after effect of the French Revolution that is not in any way adumbrated in the revolution itself. In other words, the revolution was not, let us overthrow the king so that we can have a law code. I mean, it's something that comes after and could not have come about had it not been for the revolution, but it was not a purpose of the revolution. Changes in the military are similarly not inherent in the revolution, and yet they were very significant changes. The primary one being the creation of mass citizen armies by the French Revolution. So that when you go back to the 18th century, before the Revolution, and you look at the way wars were fought, and there were many, many wars, they were typically fought by fairly small armies. That is to say, there are major battles in something like the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, as we call it in the United States, where you might have had 20 or 30,000 men in the army. And that would be a very big battle. The total size of the military available in various countries was normally well under 500,000 men at arms. And then there's a question of how was that army constituted? And it'd be constituted in two ways. You did not, in general, have conscription, though here and there it did occur. You did have essentially kidnapping and putting people on a boat and saying you're now in the Navy, or mustering them into the Army. In other words, you were continually sweeping up vagrants and adventurous young men and putting them in uniform. But the total number of, say in France, prior to the Revolution, the number of volunteers for the Army, in those occasions when you can count them, was, say, under 20,000 a year. I think 18,000 was the largest number of volunteers I've run across. So that you simply didn't have huge armies. The people in the Army were increasingly focused on the infantry, and yet there's no major change in technology at this point in time. Cannon are becoming more useful for field artillery operations as opposed to sieges, but basically people stood in line and shot at one another. The rate of fire for a gun was about, at the most 3 shots in a minute, because you had to reload. You had to reload through the muzzle. And if you had 3 shots per minute, that's your highest rate of fire. That does not allow any time for aiming. There's not much evidence that people aimed. They shot, they reloaded, they shot, they reloaded. And the amount of killing that was achieved was not sufficient to really stop an advancing infantry. In other words, when you see these pictures of a line of soldiers marching against a stationary line of soldiers, and you say, well, why are these people continuing to march forward when they're being shot at? Well, they weren't being hit for the most part. In the movies, the guy on your left is hit, the guy on your right is hit, everybody's being hit, but actually not so much. The level of casualties for a battle in the 18th century would not commonly go much over 10% of the engaged forces. And having a fusillade of musket fire was not sufficient to stop the advancing infantry, and so the battles usually ended up in hand-to-hand combat. Since so many of the soldiers were pressed into service in national armies as opposed to being volunteers, their situation was one in which they had to shoot at the enemy, because if they ran away, they would be killed by their officers. And it's sometimes conjectured that the main battlefield use of light cavalry in the 18th century was to shoot the deserters, to chase them down and kill them in order to instill in every soldier a greater fear of his own officers and of the enemy. When you say, well, the enemy isn't trying very hard to kill me, so maybe I'll just go and fight the battle, because if I turn around and run away, Sergeant so-and-so is certainly going to cut my head off. I mean, the soldiers were caught in a peculiarly unpleasant situation, and of course it's been conjectured the reason they used brightly colored uniforms was in order to make it difficult for them to hide if they ran away, so they could be easily tracked down and identified by their officers. In some places you had states that earned money by renting out armies, as the Hessians, the state of Hesse did in the Revolutionary War in America, where the Hessians fought as mercenaries. Most big wars had mercenaries fighting on one or the other side, because it was cheaper to hire an army for a war than it was to maintain an army on a regular basis. And this question of how do you pay for a war is a very important issue, not, throughout, well, down to the present day, basically. The The French Revolution did change this. France was invaded by monarchical neighbors from more than one side, and France proceeded to create conscription, in which they built an army of about 1.5 million men, which is like 3 times the size of any preceding French army. And it becomes pretty much the first army to be actively propagandized as a ideologically motivated fighting force. Unlike mercenaries who fought for pay, or unlike people who fought to avoid being killed by their own officers, the French soldiery under the Revolution fought for France. This was unusual. Now, you had national armies before, and that saw themselves as national in the sense of representing the king. The largest armies in Europe prior to the French Revolution, the largest army was probably the Swedish army under the high point of the wars under Gustavus Adolphus. And the Swedish army included about 6% of the male population, or of the total population in the army. That's a very high percentage. In the 19th century, you do have times when the army will reach 5 or 6%, and that represents a huge number of people. Say by our standards now, that would mean having 15 million people in the army, 6% of 300 million in this country, or 5%. So you started to have battles that were being fought on a much larger scale. And the French armies were consistently larger than their enemies, and this caused their enemies to start to change to having larger armies. When you had larger armies, it began to change the role of the officers, because larger armies required the movement of military forces around the battlefield and preparing for the battle, and the coordination of their travel and logistics in a way that the smaller armies of the 18th century had it had been less important. So officers in the 18th century, prior to the Revolution, were normally, in most parts of Europe, from the aristocratic portion of society. Officerships were for sale, so that if you were from the right noble background, you could start your own regiment. You had to pay for it. You had to find soldiers who were willing to fight in it or press them into service. But there was very little expectation that the officer had any particular military skill. Maybe he was trained to, sword fight or something, but he was not trained as an officer. So that what you have in the under Napoleon, after the French Revolution aftermath, is the building up of military academies for training officers. And yet, when you look at officers and you start getting bourgeois officers, but even then, recruiting good officers is difficult. There's one record of a general who commented that of the 30 captains who'd been sent to him as officers for his forces, only 3 of them were literate. So the bourgeois background of the officers was one of the big changes of the French Revolution, primarily in the infantry. Most of the cavalry officers remained nobles under Napoleon, despite the anti-aristocratic tenor of the French Revolution. So battles became larger, armies became larger, officers became more professional, the cost of the military became even more onerous, and you had conscription now as a mode of enlisting people in the army, and you could motivate them by ideology. For some countries, the question of how long you served was a crucial issue, so that the Prussians in particular adopted a practice, since they were limited in the Napoleonic era in how many people they could have in the army. They adopted the practice of conscripting people to serve for 2 years and then have them be in the reserve, a trained reserve, for another 7 or 8 years, something like that. So the notion that your army was both your active force and your reserves becomes a standard part of the military change at that time. After 1815, Napoleon is defeated. The size of the armies goes down radically. You don't have another big war in Europe until 1870, the Franco-Prussian War, or Austro-Prussian War just before it. So what happened is that the bourgeois officers are pushed out of the army, and the noblemen come back in as the primary officer corps, only now they are more likely to be trained. And this was sort of reversing what the French Revolution had visualized with respect to the aristocracy, but it represents the sense on the part of the aristocracy that the military is their particular area of expertise. And under the military academies, they get more training, although many of the aristocrats still are not highly trained. When you look at the other side of the Atlantic, you don't find any of this. The key word in the time of the American Revolution and before was militia. Militia were volunteers, initially at least, who would serve for the duration of a conflict, but would not become a standing army, would not think of themselves as the army of the Republic, did not train in the sort of line of combat style of the European armies, and the armies were comparatively small. You did have a military academy built at West Point, which was primarily for training engineers. There was little use for a professional military officer. And after by the time you get to the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, you have a very substantial debate in America over what to do about the pirates, so-called, who were the corsairs, who sailed out of Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia and Libya and would capture merchant vessels and enslave the sailors on board the vessel and steal the cargo. So these were called the Barbary pirates. And the issue with the Barbary pirates was, do you pay ransom in order to get your ship back and your sailors back, or do you go to war? And this became a big debate in the United States. the main merchants were New Englanders, the southern colonies being much more agricultural. And so most of the ships that were being seized by the Barbary pirates were from Boston or Providence or other places in New England. And the New England merchants came to regard paying ransom as part of it's like insurance, part of the cost of doing business. You know, we insure the ship, and indeed, maybe you insure the ship against piratical seizure. So, you know, if the pirates take the ship, your insurance, policy would pay for the ship. But the New Englanders did not want there to be a war. They didn't want there to be a war for several reasons. One of them was that they thought a war would cost a lot of money. And as merchants, they did not want to be taxed to pay for a war. Secondly, a war was likely to disrupt the trade that they found profitable. But thirdly, and seemingly the more important issue, was that if they authorized the federal government to wage a war against the Barbary pirates, then the government would have an army. And they did not want the federal government to have a military force. Said, you know, first Jefferson will get a navy, and if he gets a navy, then he's, find some way to get an army, because he is basically a tyrant who wants to militarize the United States, because there was really no standing army to speak of in the United States at that time. The Jeffersonians felt that paying tribute to, strange Muslim potentates in Libya was a disgrace and a scandal, and that we had to go to war to, to free these slaves and to suppress piracy. There's a great deal of publicity given to the idea of Americans being made slaves. And the New Englanders countered and said, if you want to free slaves, you don't have to go to Libya or Algeria to free slaves. You can just go out, out back and free your own slaves. The Jeffersonians did not see the logic of that. And you had a very lively national debate over the issue of is white slavery bad and black slavery okay? And you had works written saying that, well, Muslims treat their slaves nice by comparison with the way, let us say, Caribbean planters or southern planters treat their slaves. And some of the earliest stirrings of the abolitionist movement in the United States go back to this debate over whether the U.S. should go to war to free white citizens from slavery while maintaining a very large black population in slavery. Jefferson won the argument. We had a war in the early 1800s against the Barbary pirates. It's preserved in the Marine hymn that talks about the shores of Tripoli, which is where the battles were fought. We did end up with a standing navy. The war generated a dramatic poem about the glories of America fighting the war by Francis Scott Key. And then a bit later in the War of 1812, when suddenly the British invasion required that we constitute a national army and a national navy, Key rewrote the poem to talk about, "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light," to become the national anthem. But if you look at the original poem that he wrote about the Barbary pirates, it's in the same bizarre meter as the national anthem. He just liked to write poems about that kind of thing, I guess. In any case, when we think of the military history of the United States, we often overlook the fact that the colonies had individual militias, just as we have National Guards in each state now, and that they were very, very suspicious of there being a national army. So unlike the Napoleonic era in Europe, which produced bigger armies, bigger battles, national, ideologically stimulated armies, in the United States, you still had the notion that a citizen militia was the way to go, down until the Civil War, when all those things that had become expected of warfare in Europe came home to the United States, and you had massive conscription, huge armies, huge battles, and with the improvement of weapons, greater percentage of casualties. So the North American military and the European military go in somewhat different directions. South American military is convulsed in the early 1800s by a whole series of revolutionary movements that have fairly small armies but are bent on creating independent states. So this is when you get independent states starting particularly in the northern part of South America, and the exceptional case of Brazil, where the King of Portugal, who is displaced by the Napoleonic invasion, relocates to Brazil and declares Brazil an empire and becomes the Emperor of Brazil, which is initially predicated on the assumption that he will return to Portugal when times get better, but over time he becomes much more Brazilian in his outlook, and you have a Brazilian monarchy or empire down until just about the end of the 19th century. So things on the European side of the Atlantic move militarily in a somewhat different fashion than those on the other side of the Atlantic, just as they do in the area of law. There's the third thing I want to talk about, I think is more important, at least from my perspective, than the other two, and that is the question of religion. The conclusion of our chapter that my colleague wrote talks about how Western society was on its way but not yet complete after this era. And as I mentioned last time, the thing that he left out of his sort of list of criteria for a mature Western society was secularism. Religion in Europe and religion in America go in very different directions following the French Revolution and the Napoleonic period. We don't tend to write about it very much because the history of religion is, first of all, it's rather arcane, and secondly, it seems to be something that in the master narrative of the rise of modernity, religion seems to be something that is destined to fade away. For the last, say, 30 or 40 years, it has become increasingly evident that religion is not fading away. And this presents a problem of can we have a broad narrative of the last 300 years, say, that is tacitly accepting the notion that religion is obsolete after the Enlightenment and is going to become less and less important. What do we do with that narrative when the facts on the ground appear to run in the other direction? and show that religion regaining a very substantial political, social, moral role in societies subscribing to a number of different faiths. So somehow, it seems to me, we have to explain where our contemporary religious trends come from. Why are things the way they are now? Hardcore modern historians portray a revival of religion as a sort of backward-looking, medievalist, atavistic fanaticism that inexplicably attracts people, and that probably is best explained as the outlook of people who are opposed to modernity or unable to understand modernity. In other words, you explain the return of religion strictly in negative terms. The sort of, well, why do they hate us? They hate us because of our freedoms, which is not something they're saying, but rather something that we're saying. Yeah.
Extended this comparison a little bit and said that essentially the United States doesn't take on these prototypically French Revolutionary ideas, standing army, conscription, and some of these religious ideas. And then we also brought in the Islamic world, Egypt, and the Ottoman Empire. It seems that they're actually heading in the opposite direction, that they're becoming more like the French Revolution.
Yes, they are.
Majelle, you get Muhammad Ali, etc.
Yeah. No, the question, the comment deals with whether in the Islamic world things are going more in the European direction after the French Revolution and the Napoleonic period. And yes, they are. Clearly the Middle East and Europe are of a piece, as they have been for thousands of years. I mean, this is an artificial distinction between the Muslim world and the others, but these actually fall into a later chapter in the book. So I'm not going to go into details about that. Now, I want to focus really on the comparison between what you get on this side of the Atlantic versus what you get in Europe. The American Revolution is preceded by a period of religious ferment called the Great Awakening. It is followed starting roughly around the 1820s by a second Great Awakening. So the revolution is sandwiched between two very powerful religious movements. These religious movements are very similar to one another, and they are highly populist. The first Great Awakening is George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards are the primary preachers. Whitefield is an Englishman. He comes to America to take over the ministry that in Savannah, Georgia, that had been under John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church. Whitefield and John Wesley and Wesley's brother Charles were all part of a club at the Holy Club, so-called, at Oxford, and they were religious zealots. The hallmark of their ministry was open-air preaching. What in later times would become revival meetings, where you would get great throngs of people coming to hear these preachers. Whitefield in particular was said to have had audiences of 10 to 20,000 people listening to some of his sermons. He was a short, cross-eyed man, but apparently had a powerful, powerful voice. He was a friend of Benjamin Franklin, who at one point actually measured he was listening to him preach, and he walked until he found that he could no longer distinguish what the sermon was, and then he calculated the area of people who could hear it, and he divided it by 2 square feet per person, and said, well, there could have been 20,000 people there who actually heard him speak. And Whitefield traveled around. He came to the United States 7 times, gave thousands and thousands of sermons, and like Jonathan Edwards in New England, his sermons were extremely emotional, so that the idea that people would feel the Holy Spirit and get up and hallelujah, amen, and share in the experience. This is what became characteristic of the Great Awakening and of the subsequent revival movements in the United States, so that this notion of a charisma that would be the distinctive characteristic of a particular preacher becomes built into this aspect of American religion. The Methodist and the Baptist churches, starting around 1800, a little bit later, grow phenomenally. So that if you look at the growth rates for the Baptists and the Methodists and compare them, say, with the Episcopalians or the Congregationalists or the Catholics, you have a explosive growth for Baptists and Methodists, and they are the groups that are participating in these revivalist movements, and they are mostly in western parts of the United States, or rural parts of the United States. There is clearly a very populist character to this, but it's a type of populism that we are familiar with now, in the sense that the doctrines that were being enunciated maintained that to be saved, that it was never hopeless. It wasn't the most hardcore Calvinist view that would hold that you were predestined to heaven or hell on the day of your birth, but rather you could gain, through your faith and through your trust in God, at least the appearance of living a perfect life. And you could be redeemed from sin. Wesley believed that then you could atone, but that everybody was susceptible to temptation, that you had to fight continually against temptation to lead this perfect life. The notion of taking Jesus or God as your personal guide in daily affairs becomes a part of this. The idea that you should monitor the behavior of your neighbors and try and improve it by telling them what bad Christians they are for drinking or doing other bad things becomes a part of it. Basically, almost most of the things that you find in evangelical Protestantism today are present in the 18th century, but even more around between the 1820s and 1840s in the Second Great Awakening. There is in the Second Great Awakening, there is the growth of new churches. There is a man named Miller who predicted that the world was coming to an end. His followers were Millerites. When the world did not come to an end in the early 19th century, the event known by his followers as the Great Disappointment, some of his followers maintained that the world had, in fact, come to an end, and that now we were in the stage of the Last Judgment. But God had to work through the lives of each human to determine whether they should be saved or damned, and that was a big job. It would take him many, many, many years to finish the Last Judgment. The Last Judgment was not, just sort of snap your fingers and it's all done, but rather God had to review everything because God is just, and therefore you had the doctrine that the Last Judgment began and is continuing, and therefore you should act in an extremely observant fashion. And this is the Seventh-day Adventist sect that arose at that time. But that's only one of several sects. The Mormons begin at this time, the Shakers. In other words, it's a period of religious revival, but also of religious ferment, in which you have new sects coming into being that bear only sort of a marginal relationship, even to the Methodists and the Baptists, but even more to the conventional Church of England, Presbyterian, Congregationalist background that you had from England. Why this Great Awakening took place, it's been debated. Some people feel that there are precursor events in what were called holy fairs in Scotland in the 18th century, where people would get together and be holy together, although some of the descriptions of the fairs make them sound a little unholy. But by and large, this seems to be an American, more an American phenomenon than something that has a direct relationship to what was going on at the same time in England. So in a sense, religion appears to be almost inseparable from the mental outlook or the moral outlook of the people who lived through the American Revolution. On the other hand, the state that they created was a secular state. Secular in the sense that it would not support any particular religion and would permit all religions to operate. The assumption presumably being that everyone would have a religion. Even today, of course, when you poll Americans about what they would think of having an atheist for president, the negative opinion on an atheist president has been massive and unchanging for decades. We gradually accept a woman president, or I imagine people would even accept a Muslim president before an atheist president, because it's just wrong to be an atheist in the popular mind. So that typically you'll have, in America, people say, well, you should, in this moment of crisis, you should go and pray in the church or synagogue of your choice. Well, what about not praying? Is that an option? Can we say, no, in response to this terrible tragedy, you should pray in the church or synagogue of your choice, or not, whatever you like? No. The idea of freedom of religion was that you were free to be religious of whatever description of religion you had in mind, but you shouldn't feel free to be non-religious. Now, what is strange here is that, to me, is that you get a disjuncture that grows between a national ideology of separation of the government from an established religion and the mentality of the people who become intensely or continue to be intensely religious. Quite a number of years ago, I was pursuing research on what names parents give to their sons. I had a theory that said that if you looked at a quantitative, large quantitative bodies of names, that you would find suggestive patterns in the names of parents gave to their son. This was based to their sons. This was based upon two assumptions. The first assumption was that naming an infant is more or less the only act of free will you ever have. The infant can't fight you, and it's your call. This isn't true in all societies. Some societies will have limits. So you have to have a name that's the name of a Catholic saint or something like that. But in American society, you could name your son George or Keyshawn or Lily, whatever you want. It's up to you. So you have free will, which humans are very uncomfortable with in general, and therefore it takes them 9 months to figure out how to solve that dilemma. It's much harder to name a child than it is to buy a car, where you have certain choices, certain parameters, and so on. The other assumption is that one of the factors that enter into the decision chain that parents go through is, will this name be good for my son? I'm using sons here because daughters are kind of a different situation. Your daughters are not necessarily, particularly prior to the 20th century, not necessarily assumed to be people who are going to live a public life. They will marry, they will have children, their status will be determined more by their spouse than by their own achievements. A typical, sexist sort of situation. So, but with sons, I had the thought that parents will name some sons after famous people or after an uncle who died, or having the same initial as the uncle who died, or something like that. But at some point, they will take into account, or many of them will take into account, whether a name is good for their son, whether it's going to serve his interest. Let's say that the number of boys named Adolf in this country plummeted after, say, 1933 or so, and still has not come back. I have never met any boy in this country, citizen of America, who's named Adolf. There's a reason for that. You think, gee, now I grow up and I'm Adolf. I mean, you don't want that. And the same reason you don't find many boys named Lily. But if you take those two assumptions, then you say, if I aggregate large numbers of male names and divide them by date of birth, I can see kind of a profile of social psychology of the parents, not of the children themselves, but of the parents. So to test that theory, it was a theory I was interested in because I had done similar work in Turkey, and subsequently I've done similar work about naming of sons in Iran. But I was interested in seeing whether theories that I was applying to the Muslim world would work just as well for for my own culture. So I decided, what's the easiest source of a large number of names that extends over a very long period of time in the United States, and that is easily accessible, and that I can coerce a TA into tabulating for me. Phone book doesn't give you a date of birth. Problem is, you need a date of birth, and you also have to go back before there were telephones. So there are some things that weren't very easy. Well, the easiest thing it turned out to be, in my view, was the alumni lists of Harvard University, simply because they go on for so long, from 1636 when the university opens, and because they are, up until the 1950s, almost exclusively people from Massachusetts. It was only after World War II that Harvard began to democratize in the sense, in its notion of taking in people from other parts of the country and from public high schools. So I started tabulating, or getting my minion to tabulate these thousands of names, and came up with a interesting graph. You know, several different types of graph. The one now is a graph where here is a time axis, there's a percentage axis. What I was interested in is what percentage of the Harvard students have names from the Old Testament, names from the Bible, and leaving aside the name John, simply because it is so, until really the 1990s, it was the most popular name in every age cohort throughout American history. So leaving aside John, then what was the status of biblical names? It turned out that you start around 1600 with about 40%, 35 to 40% biblical names. And then it goes up, peaks at around 45%. So the most popular names are Benjamin, Samuel, Daniel, but you also get the Ebenezers and the Zacharias and so forth and so on. Oddly enough, David is not particularly common, although it's an Old Testament name. But you get these very, very, absolutely incontrovertible names from the Bible. Then you have an inflection point. Goes up to 45% and then heads down in a curve that is almost smooth. I was using 3-year running averages, and so I smoothed it out somewhat. And the biblical names disappear. So by the time you get to the bottom of the curve, you find that 8% of these Harvard lads were given biblical names at the time of their birth. So the question was, what is the inflection point? When does the Bible disappear, or begin to disappear, from the mental equipment of parents as they are thinking about the lives of their sons? And for all intents and purposes, it's 1776. With the creation of the United States, the Republic, people in Massachusetts began to think that maybe a biblical name is less pertinent than a non-biblical name. And they continued to think that way until the biblical names virtually disappeared, so that you got no more Benjamins, no more Daniels. People associated the remaining biblical names sometimes with backward rural areas. So someone is called Zeke, you think, oh, that's deliverance for you. I mean, someone named Zeke is obviously a hick. or Ebenezer. I mean, but the fact of the matter is that this was a very clear trend. So what you have is that and this state here, it's approximately 1850. So throughout the Second Great Awakening, you're having a passion for religion and a diminution of biblical naming. And this is puzzling, except that it suggests that the division of church and state may play a role here, that people as citizens are getting citizen names, and yet they are expected personally to be people of religious conviction.
How do you account for the class and regional difference? Because it seems to me that this self-selects a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
Religious can't go to Harvard.
No. Okay. The question of regional and sectoral stratification. I wanted to have a highly homogeneous body, because then if there was a single trend, it would stand out. Instead of having overlapping trends, that would be harder to, then I'd have to work with subcategories of the population. It's hard to do. However, no one, even then, well, maybe even more so then, was a Harvard graduate at birth. So the fact that they're Harvard graduates spoke to the social and economic capacity of their parents, but not to their own personal accomplishment, because they got their name before anybody knew who they were. So yes, it is the the bourgeois class of Massachusetts that's represented here. On the other hand, that is very likely to be the class that was most sensitive to the issue of citizenship, to the sorts of questions that were bound up in the Barbary Wars about what is the role of the government and so forth. Now, if you look at what names people were given who were not being given biblical names, what do people shift to?
Saints' names?
Saints' names? No, there are no Catholics in this crowd.
Well, people who were Thomas, Chris, Michael, Matt.
Nope. They're the first names of the English kings. George, William, Edward, Richard. Not Richard so much, but they are the most mundane English first names. They are not from the Bible, nor are they saints' names. Well, George is really tricky, because the first president was named George, and our opponent was named George in the Revolutionary War. So George is kind of a wash. You could be a Tory and name your son George, or you could be a patriot and name your son George, and nobody would know. So George does become one of the new names. But then you get down here, and you're stuck at 8%. You're stuck at 8%. Then the curve goes up, starting in the 1950s. And there are two thoughts that I've had on that. One is that is when Harvard diversified. For example, when the Irish are moving into Boston and the Italians are moving into Boston, you don't see Patrick and Michael and Luigi showing up on the Harvard alumni lists, because they're not bringing these immigrant groups into Harvard. But by the time you get to the 1950s, when Harvard in the post-war era is, as with Columbia or Princeton or other, self-proclaimed elite institutions, they're trying to diversify. That is when you begin to see the return of religion. But then but by that time, you also have global statistics for the United States as a whole. And you can see that, yes, this is when religious naming begins to appear. And you get, Jonathan instead of John. Oddly enough, in this later period, what you find mostly are New Testament names. So Luke and Mark, Matthew, these become important names here, and they don't exist at all here. Paul. So there's something very New Testament about the revival of religion in this country from the 1950s on. And at this point, my sample becomes much more chaotic because I don't have the assurance I had earlier that I was dealing with a fairly homogeneous social group. When I was doing this, I thought that quantitative onomastics was the wave of the future for studying social psychology from a historical point of view, and then nobody would publish my article on the subject, so I decided it was not the wave of the future. And so I've sat on this for 30 years. But I'm still intrigued by it because I think it does suggest that there was a fundamental change in mental outlook that came along with the American Revolution, and that it was, in one sense, it was secular, but insofar as it is simultaneous with very powerful religious currents, it seems to me that it represents more this notion of a separation of citizenry from religion, rather than the disappearance of religion from Massachusetts life.
Is Massachusetts a scene of the evangelicals, or is it still the Presbyterians and the Church?
Jonathan Edwards was a Massachusetts preacher in the First Great Awakening, and but it's true that you have more of the Congregationalist and Unitarian and Episcopalian sects in Massachusetts, and probably even more in the roster of Harvard graduates than you would have had at large. And it's possible, I have no way of, I don't have any data on it, it's possible that people were going to secular names in order to distinguish themselves from the zealots in the Second Great Awakening, saying we're not one of those Methodists or Baptists who continue to name their son Zeke, but rather we are, they're much more English. Now the interesting thing is that as the curve of presidential names comes up, or not presidential, but of names of the kings, then it goes down, and you get another rising curve, which is not defined by particular names. You have clusters of names that come and go, but is defined by the variety of naming. And in statistics, there's something called an index of dispersion, where you say that if you have, say 100 people and they're all of the same name, then there's no dispersal, it's 0. If you have 100 people and 100 different names, then it's 1. It's the index between 0 and 1, and you have total dispersal. The reason you look at this is to see whether, when you have a growing variety of names, whether in fact people are still focusing just on a handful of the most popular ones. But what you find is that from a low point right in here, it's actually a little bit earlier than this 1850, from a low point there, in where you have very little variety in naming, you have an explosion in the number of names given to these Massachusetts citizens and in the variety of the names. I did a parallel study of graduates of an Oxford college, and you have almost no dispersion. In England, at a similar social level, there are only, a dozen or so names, and most people had 3 or 4 of them. John, Richard, Edward, Throckmorton or something, because they had multiple first names. But in America, you had an amazing spread of names, and one of the most you look at it and say, why do you get so many names? And one of the things that happens is that virtually every last name becomes a first name. So if you had, say, in Massachusetts, the Cabots and the Lowells and the Lodges, then you'll have someone who, at one point you had Ebenezer Lowell and then maybe John Cabot, but then by 1850 or so you're going to get Cabot Lowell and Lowell Lodge and Lodge Cabot Lowell, so forth. And all these names become first names. And it's the creation of a national identity that people become, this is a time when people become obsessed by their genealogies, and they don't go back, they don't have a mother country to go back to, but they start turning their last names into first names. So, how else would we get a Confederate president named Jefferson Davis? Jefferson is obviously a last name. So, there are very complicated things going on in the social psychology at this time, but it is strikingly different from the social psychology that you get in England and continental Europe with respect to religion. Napoleon in 1801 has an agreement with Pope Pius VII in what's called the Concordat, that the agreement states that the majority of the people in France are Catholics, but it does not make Catholicism the religion of France. It says you can be French and be of some other religion, but recognizing that the majority of the people are Catholics. It recognizes the power of the Pope to remove a bishop from office, but the bishops are nominated by the French government. The Pope cannot put his own man into a bishopric. Religious figures, priests and so forth, are paid a salary from the state, so long as they swear allegiance to the state. You get different variants of this in other parts of Europe in the Napoleonic, post-Napoleonic time, but the idea that every religious figure who holds a position in a church or synagogue or whatever receives a salary from the state becomes commonplace in Europe, where in the United States it's anathema. We cannot have the federal government paying a salary to the Archbishop of New York City. That's just wrong. But in Europe, that's the norm. You have other situations where, for example, you have the law passed requiring that every child, say in the Belgian law, every child is required to be instructed in religion in the public schools, in the religion of his or her faith, so that the public schools had to teach Catholicism to the Catholic students, Protestantism to the Protestant students, Judaism to the Jewish students. If you were an atheist in modern interpretation, you were allowed to be excused from religion classes. And then, of course, you got the issue of, will the state pay a salary to a Muslim to teach Islam in the public schools? And of course, that was required by the Belgian constitution. There was resistance to that idea until the Saudi government said, we will pay the salary of the imams who teach Islam in your public schools. But of course, then they were going to be taught Saudi Islam, and this ended up getting the chief of the Saudi educational mission to Belgium assassinated. Because there were parents, I don't think they ever found the assassin, I'm sure it's a parent who said, I'll be damned if I can have my kid taught by a Saudi imam. But the thing is, control of religion became the norm. You know, the French Revolution tried to abolish religion. That didn't work. But control of religion becomes the norm in Europe and the Middle East. Whereas a laissez-faire attitude toward religion, accompanied by an expectation that every citizen will be a religious person, becomes the norm in the United States. And in this sense, America parts company from Europe. So that, let's say, European numbers for belief in a divine being are, on a percentage basis, very, very small. In America, it's 60%, which is extraordinary, because most of the correlation is worldwide. A study that's been done is that the lower the per capita income, the stronger the belief in God. And that as your per capita income goes up, according to what we think of modernization, people become less and less religious. And that works pretty well for Europe, although some of the least religious countries in the world are the post-Soviet Baltics, who are just totally fed up with the whole thing. But there are some outliers. That is to say, some countries that are in the highest category for per capita income are Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Sheikdoms, and they also have 90% belief in God. But aside from the oil states, the only country in the world that has a really high per capita income and a really high belief in God is the United States. And, you know, this is going to turn out to be historically consequential. And when we look at people who assume, if they're writing about Europe, that Europe is post-Christian, you cannot assume that the United States is post-Christian. And therefore, the notion that you have a Western society that is characterized by secularism, you have a Western society that is characterized by particular relations with religion, but they're two different flavors. You know, one's chocolate, one's peppermint. The Europeans want to control religion, and they don't believe. Americans want to have a laissez-faire attitude toward religion, and they want and expect people to be believers. So we don't have a Western civilization that ends up on the same page in this respect. And I would say that to some degree that applies also to the military and to the legal outlook, that what happens in the Americas, particularly in North America, although there are parallels that we'll get into in another chapter in other parts of the New World, is really profoundly different from what is happening in the Old World. That's it.